I cannot imagine the first steps in the beginning of this quite unbelievable relationship between humans and dogs. I mean, did a couple of wolves, if we know anything about that, did a couple of wolves just figure out that humans have food all the time, so they started chilling by the campfire regularly, thus making themselves less aggressive? Or did we catch a bunch of wolves randomly and then select the more gentle ones and keep those? Or was it something else entirely? Do we have anything backed by evidence that would tell us something about this crucial phase between dogs and us?
Right. No, is the short answer. We have nothing backed by evidence.
So a bunch of stories again.
We have a bunch of stories, and some of those stories are predicated on that desire for control, right? So the simplest story is X number of thousand years ago, say 20, 25,000 years ago, a couple of people saw some wolves. We're familiar with wolves. They're on the landscape just like them. They're probably hunting the same thing. And they thought, you know what? We know where those wolf dens are. So let's go grab a couple of puppies and bring them back and maybe even breastfeed them, right? Like, but let's rear
makes
them.
Sense. Yes.
Makes sense. Let's rear them from a very early age, because we know that if we take a wild wolf puppy, we can raise it and there'll be this thing called a dog. Like, it just, like, would you think about that? If you were to do that with like a lion, which is not that dissimilar, right? Would you possibly go grab a lion cub and be like, I am confident that, or a tiger? Talk to Siegfried and Roy about doing that with tigers, right? Like, it's like there's this whole, no, bad idea. And there's been study after study after study that have demonstrated things to do with critical period and socialization and just the way and fear responses and all this kind of thing. A hand-reared, human-reared wolf puppy is not a dog. These are very, very different things. And I don't care how many generations you think you get, and then just to make sure you could keep them and then breed them together and keep the tamest ones, how many you got, right? What do you got, 100 of them and you get to choose the 10? And where are you keeping them? And what are you feeding them? And why? This is some sort of controlled experiment where you can stake them and hold them down the whole time. Meanwhile, you don't have anything else to do. So the simplest story in this case sounds great. And then when you start to put it into practice, it falls apart for me instantly. The problem, though, is that any story when it comes to dogs falls apart instantly. And and that's what's so fun about this, is that anytime somebody goes, oh, well, how about this idea of wolves just coming around and hanging out? And it's like, okay, but how much waste would there have to be in order for them to sustain that population? And wouldn't humans just immediately chase them off? These are animals that, like, they're competing for you on the landscape, and they're actively dangerous. If how many dogs kill people in the UK right now? There's a huge thing about the bully X breed, and therefore, because there's all this press focus on attention, it seems like every 2 weeks a bully X is biting someone or killing someone or maiming a toddler or whatever else. But it's not just the bully X. In the UK every year, there's dozens of people who either get seriously injured or killed from dogs. And we think a tame wolf is a good idea, right? So the kind of model that I like to use in this, though, is around the idea, like an evolutionary thing, where what we see is a lot of times animals will form or go down trajectories of evolution and behavior that have a lot to do with food, and that gets embedded into a culture. So there's this really great example of killer whales off the northwest coast of the Americas. So there's two main ways of living as a killer whale. You can either hunt marine mammals, seals and the like, or you eat salmon. Now, the two pods of killer whales that do this, when they have killer whale babies, they train them to eat those things. And there's very different styles of hunting. You got to know where you have to be at certain times of year. You have to be able to communicate between each other about how to get them, especially if you're chasing seals. And there's a huge amount of time and effort and learning that goes into procuring that specific kind of prey. The two populations are still killer whales. They're not. It's like, they're effectively you and me in terms of our degree of distance. So there's nothing preventing them from mating and producing offspring, but they don't. It's human cultures. Think of the same thing. If we had to go to like Shakespeare with Montagues and Capulets, right? There's nothing stopping Romeo and Juliet except for the weight of culture around both of them. or sharks and jets or whatever you want. And that is not insignificant. And so there's a good reason why there was no F1 hybrid between Romeo and Juliet. It wasn't because they were incapable of doing so. It was because their families were like over our dead bodies, and quite literally our dead bodies, right? So, and similarly with killer whales, and you can see it with a whole range of other animals, when you get one group of them starting to focus in on one particular resource and another group focusing on a different resource, that is the thin edge of a wedge, which will start to distinguish those two populations and start preventing gene flow between them. As soon as you start preventing that gene flow, now you can allow other things to layer on top of that to then further ratchet up the division between them, and then even more reducing the likelihood of gene flow between them. So in wolves, we have this. So there are wolves in Canada, a group of wolves that follow the caribou. That they're this caribou wolves, and they go up and down every year with a caribou migration, and they protect those caribou from other wolves, and they coordinate with each other about how to identify one that might be slightly lame, and they go after, they pick it off, and they're basically always in tow of these caribou. There's other wolves in the forest in Western Canada who don't really go that far, and they subsist on a diet that changes through the year depending on what the forest is willing to give them, and they're very good at identifying where to go when certain things are available. Very much like, you know, our human ancestors were in changing climates and changing times, seasons during the year. When do you store stuff? When do you harvest stuff? And where to go at certain times? Those wolves occasionally will run into each other. And again, it's very similar. They look at each other, they recognize each other as wolves. They will be sometimes even friendly with each other, but they don't mate, or at least they mate very occasionally. It doesn't happen very often. So you're starting to get this thin edge of the wedge. So because of my general suspicion around top-down, human-led, it was us, we're smart, we went and did everything, and the demonstration that, at least with rabbits and with chickens and a host of other things, that's not quite entirely true. I'm not saying that we weren't intentional in some ways, or there wasn't some part of a human making a decision at some point, but it certainly wasn't to domesticate. Nobody pulled a chicken out of a tree to eat it. That's not how this worked. So why would it be then, if you have no other domestic animals whatsoever, that you would grab a wolf puppy of all things? I mean, geez, at least a lamb is not going to eat you, right? Like it's just crazy. So what I think is probably happening is that there is a relationship forming between a population, maybe two, maybe more populations of wolves, and a group of people, where you start to get this association largely driven by some sort of food stroke resource availability shared thing. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that looks like. But if you can imagine that wolves then start following those people in the way that modern wolves will follow caribou, and then we become their caribou, then not only then are you severing the gene flow between those wolves and other wolves, but they're actively protecting us from their conspecifics, where they don't want any other wolves associating with us. And that starts this ratcheting process where they're getting closer to us and vice versa, so long as that process is happening as well. But at least you have an initiation of the severance of the gene flow. Whereas if you were just grabbing a puppy and you let it go out, why would it not hybridize with something else? And then those offspring are coming nowhere near us. So I just feel like there are evolutionary models that exist that don't require the first step of being somebody smart stealing a puppy. I'm not saying that there wasn't some kind of action like that involved at some stage, but I feel like to get there, to be the very first thing through the door, it's not intentional. There's got to be something else going on. And when one possibility, and we're kind of looking into this too, is that around the last glacial maximum, 20,000 or so, 22,000 years ago, certainly in Siberia, there's a few places where there are these kind of enclaves where it appears that those regions aren't being hit quite as hard by the cold and the ice and everything else. And what you're seeing in the run up to that is a huge drop in the populations of a lot of large mammals. And wolves are no exception. They get absolutely hammered in terms of their total population size, and paleontologically, they almost vanish off the landscape. So it could be that what you've got is a kind of climate forcing thing where you don't have a huge amount of space where everything can coexist, and everything is a bit on the edge of their survivorship. And then you've got this kind of, it's almost like being forced on a blind date, where you have this population of wolves and these populations, they're all just in the same place. Well, what are we gonna do? I guess we'll just hang out for a while, and and then at the end of that, you may have formed this relationship, which was the basis for the process which turned that population of wolves into dogs. And then from there, once that relationship starts, and this is what we see with the chickens come to people, not the other way around, because of this or the dry rice agriculture arrives in Peninsular Southeast Asia 3,500 years ago. That kind of ecological footprint involved with that sort of rice agriculture is just a huge magnet to the chickens, because it looks a lot like the blooms that they saw with a lot of the other things that they were eating. So that draws them into a human niche. But once they're associated, it's the classic thing, like come for one thing and stay for something else. So the chickens came for the dry rice, but once they were associated, then it was like, oh, you got millet, you got rice, you got wheat. Sure, we'll do that too, right? But it was the dry rice that brought them in. And then once they're associated with people, the grain ceases to matter. But you need that dry rice to get them in first place, because that's where they are and that's where the dry rice is. And it's the same thing with wolves. Once you have dogs, now you go through this process where you can do anything. And look at what dogs do for us now, right? I mean, nobody would have grabbed a wolf puppy with the intent of putting it into an airport to sniff drugs coming from teenagers coming back from spring break in Mexico, right? That's not why people did that. But yet that's the same kind of rationale that we use whenever we impose that kind of top down, we did it for X, because why X and not Y or Z or a million other things. So I'm always curious and interested in what are the mechanisms that would allow something like this to happen that do not require a couple of very smart people X thousand years ago to just decide that a podcast in 20,000 years would be discussing it and they would get credit for
it. How very interesting. I like the story that it all began, this great love affair began with the reluctant first date from both sides.
That's
it
how
does make
everything
some
works.
sort of intuitive sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, think about your own partners throughout your life.
Yeah, it was certainly a lot of reluctant dates there, yeah, from the other side. Yeah.
Exactly. But how often is it that who chooses, who actively goes out and says, I'm going to steal you and you're going to be okay, sure, this
It's
happens.
terrifying.
What I mean,
yes.
But that's never romantic. That's not the romantic ideal, right? It's supposed to be a mutual thing, right? It's supposed to be two people meeting eyes across the room, or whatever cliche you want to use. And that's a far more fun narrative. So why don't we apply that to our domestic animals and plants?
Right.
I mean,
Makes sense.
we should be giving agency to these things as much as we have ourselves, because frankly, neither of us had any agency in the way in which this result happens. I mean, you hear this about, people say this about love, right? You don't choose who you love. You don't choose who you domesticate. Why should we?
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing to Smart Cookies on YouTube. What else is there? Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you really liked what you heard, feel free to become my patron on Patreon by going to Patreon and becoming my patron. It's really easy. Just type Smart Cookies Podcast in there. You should be able to find me. Last but not least, I have to thank the absolute legends that are my producers on this show, my existing patrons on Patreon: Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Gordon, Jurechuk, Lorenzo, Mila, Carmen, Taichi, Goran, and Veronica. Without you guys, this show wouldn't exist. So massive thanks. And yeah, see you in the next episode.